All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to support and inspire new trauma therapists just starting out on the trauma-informed journey. I do that with my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0, my online courses and workshops, and the Trauma Therapist newsletter. If you're a therapist of any kind and you work with individuals who've been impacted by trauma, I invite you to head on over to my website at thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. All right, let's get started. All right, Sherry. Yes?
Yes.
Ready? All right, here we go. All right, so 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. Very excited to have as my guest today, Dr. Sherry Walling. Sherry, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be with you, Guy.
Awesome. So Sherry is a clinical psychologist, speaker, podcaster, author, and mental health advocate. She's a graduate of the University of California, Davis and Fuller School of Psychology. She has a PhD in clinical psychology and master's degrees in both psychology and theology, and completed research fellowships at Yale University School of Medicine and the National Center for PTSD in Boston. Jesus, that's awesome.
I've been busy.
She spent several years working with veterans before going on to become the director of clinical training at House Psychiatric Clinic in Fresno, California. Her company, ZenFounder, helps entrepreneurs and leaders navigate transition, rapid growth, loss, conflict, or any manner of complex human experience. Sherry's soon-to-be-released new book is called Touching Two Worlds, in which she explores the inner workings of her own grief and leaves a kind of hand-drawn map for those rebuilding hope in the aftermath of loss. Sherry, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So before we get going here, share with the listeners where you are from originally and where you are now.
I am originally from Northern California, little city called Redding near Mount Shasta.
Yep.
And I currently live in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So I've
Awesome.
done the reverse transition. I've gone from California to the Midwest, which is opposite of what my parents did.
All right. So let's get going here. How did all this come about? I want to talk about initially your interest in psychology, how that came about, and transition into the interest in trauma, and then obviously how this book came about.
Yeah. Lots of stories to cover those three transitions. But in many ways, like many other psychologists, I was sort of raised to be a psychologist. I grew up in a family that had a lot of complexity, generally loving, but had some complexity. And so there were lots of things that were unspoken. And so my job as the oldest daughter was to observe what was unspoken and help to ease those needs, or create space, or, sort of tend to the things that were going on under the emotional surface. Mm-hmm. And I got really good at that, as, sometimes oldest daughters do. And that turned into what has become a very rich profession as a psychologist, of really being able to see what's underneath words or hear what's not spoken, and tend to the difficult things that are sometimes hard to name and hard to talk about.
So I'm sure we might surmise or guess, but what was unspoken in your family that you saw or needed to see?
I think my parents came from very conservative, evangelical faith tradition, grew up in the Midwest, and they were really thrown when they had experiences that were difficult to integrate with their worldview. And one of those experiences was my mother's diagnosis of multiple sclerosis shortly after I was born. So I grew up with a mother who had a disability, who was walking with a cane or sometimes not walking. And the tradition that they came from had language for conquering suffering, or praying through, holding faith through suffering, but didn't have so much language for grieving suffering, or, creating a language around, hey, this is hard. Those were the things that were not named. There was the language of conquering, but there was not the language of pain, or of acknowledging that something was difficult.
Interesting. Okay. So how do things unfold such that you say to yourself, I want to pursue psychology?
Well, I wanted to pursue medicine, but I really didn't like organic chemistry, and
Oh
it
my
was very
God. I did
difficult
the
for
same
me.
thing.
It was sort of the weed out
Oh,
class.
yep, yep, yep.
So yeah. And I had a couple of doctors in my life who were mentors who said, looking at kind of who you are and what you really love, like you may want to consume or consider something more interpersonal than medicine is becoming. That was their sort of critique of the direction of medicine at that time. So psychology felt like a reasonable fit. And I was at UC Davis and I studied abroad my junior year of university and went to West Africa. And it was in West Africa that I had all kinds of experiences, sort of understanding, of course, sociological and cultural differences, but really getting curious about how people work and the drivers that shape resilience, the drivers that shape all kinds of, conflict and just the choices that we make as humans. So that became my deep curiosity, and of course led to a graduate degree in psychology.
Okay, so you get your graduate degree in psychology. Talk more about, or share with us, this interest in trauma and PTSD.
I ended up in a lab. I went to Fuller, so I had this interesting experience of integrating psychology and theology. But I ended up in a research lab that was very focused on trauma, largely because I really loved the professor who was leading the research lab, a woman named Cynthia Erickson, but also because I felt that I really wanted to continue that conversation that I'd started in my childhood with, how do we speak of the hard things? How do we speak of the unspeakable or unspoken things? And so the process of giving language to fear, to pain, is really very much the beginning of the dance with trauma therapy, or helping to help people feel more comfortable in their traumatic experiences. And so that felt like a really natural fit. I like kind of high adrenaline people. I didn't know this then, right? I didn't have that awareness then, but looking back, like I've always been the one who's drawn to the military officer or the ER doctor or the entrepreneur. And those are the people that I've most loved serving, because I love their ambition and I love their drive and I love their kind of willingness to dive into difficult situations. And that, of course, those are communities that do experience a lot of trauma. And that's who I wanted to be in support of.
I love the way you phrase that, how do we speak of the hard things? Because for a young kid to be able to see, like you were explaining, to see what's going on in the family and what's not going on in the family, what's not being spoken of, and to take that on. Was that something that just came naturally to you? Did you need to see what was not being spoken as a survival mechanism, or that's just the way you were wired, or both?
I think it's both, right? It is my gifting, right? I've always loved language. I was a reader. I was a writer, even as a child. So the ability to give voice to what I'm observing feels like it's part of me, which of course was nurtured through school and academics. And, it was a resource that people sort of poured fuel on the flame. But I think maybe a little bit darker part of that is that I grew up in a family that really needed for somebody to name those things. And I was the nominated speaker, I was the nominated person, sort of a parentified child. And so there's gift in that and there's pain in that. It doesn't simply fit in one category or the other.
Where was the pain for you?
I think the pain was in responsibility, right? And being a kid who's watching the emotional experiences of my parents and feeling the need to help or to hold those on their behalf. So that was heavy for me and has continued to be heavy through much of my life. In fact, the book that I've written is about, and to some extent, the heaviness of being the caretaker for my dad and brother as they were dying, and still continuing to hold the emotional experience on behalf of my family.
So before we get into the book and Again, I just want to remind everyone that I'm speaking with Sherry Walling. The book is called Touching Two Worlds, and it's out July
26th.
26th. Okay. So did you create, so you were working, I just want to go back to the clinic you were working at. How did things unfold before you created your company, ZenFounder? Was that, when did you start that?
I started that about 6 years ago. So I had trained as an academic, right? I thought I would be a researcher, and used my first few moves in my career were to be a professor and to be teaching. And I found that to be a little bit too constricting for me. I really wanted, I think, to be a little bit more of a creative clinician than tier one research track would have supported.
Mm-hmm.
So I found my way to a clinic led by a psychiatrist named Matt House, who just has become a wonderful mentor and friend. And he's a psychiatrist, but also trained as a clinician at Menninger Clinic, and just had this really deep, nuanced understanding of what we're doing as healers. And so I had the ability to work in his clinic and then to develop the clinical training program there, where we were bringing in trainees and supervising them and teaching them. And that was a beautiful balance of teaching and creativity and knowledge sharing for me. But I married a tech entrepreneur. So I married a man named Rob, who has started and sold several technology companies. And in my life as a clinician, I was, working often with people who had very high intensity jobs and who'd had some either trauma in the context of their job or just really high intense stress in their job. And then I'd go home, and in my living room were all of these tech entrepreneurs, and they were having some of the same challenges, right? Feeling unable to separate themselves from their work, spinning on things that had happened in the context of the company that they were building, and finding it just to be overwhelming pressure. And so it was in the pairing of my work and my husband's work that my company ZenFounder was born, which is to provide mental health resources to entrepreneurs. So I left my clinical training work because my husband sold a company, and it brought us to move from California to Minneapolis. And so it was time for a generation for me, a regeneration for me.
Do you, when I was reading through your bio, you had worked with, was it veterans?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Is there a kind of commonality in the way that veterans and entrepreneurs perceive PTSD or trauma? Because obviously in veterans, there's this, the idea, and I think it's even more of the reality, that there's a denial there, and almost because they need to do that, certainly on the battlefield. But are entrepreneurs the same way? Do they no, I'm not, this is not happening for me, or I'm not dealing with this, or what's your experience?
I think there's a little bit of a normalization. I mean, they're both categories of people who run toward the problem, who kind of have something inside of them that says, I'll jump into that mess. That can be my job. I'll sign up for that job.
Right.
And in a way, I think because there's some satisfaction in doing this big, heroic, important thing, there's a denial that work also can be your undoing, right? I think there's a common sort of denial of the shadow side of this big, intense job that you're pulled toward.
Yeah.
So I think there's a desire to say, I can do this and it won't hurt me, or I can do this and it won't cost me, is certainly a shared commonality that I've experienced between entrepreneurs and between veterans.
So what do you do with the company in ZenFounder? What's your mission there? What's your goal?
Yeah, we want to help entrepreneurs become literate in mental health. So that looks like a lot of different things. It's a lot of teaching, it's a lot of giving talks and writing papers, and just sort of helping people who are leading companies know just sort of basic mental health 101 kinds of things. I also work a lot one-on-one with entrepreneurs who are experiencing different challenges and transitions that they're facing. I work with leadership teams. So there's both the one-to-many and one-to-one model that we do within our team.
Okay. All right. So let's touch on this new book here, Touching Two Worlds. Walk us through how this came about, if you would.
Yeah. So I started writing this book a couple days after my dad was diagnosed with esophageal cancer. And writing, as I mentioned, was some of my way of just processing what was happening. So I was observing and then I was writing, observing and expressing.
And when
So
was this?
This was in February of 2017.
Okay.
And he died in November of 2018. So we had this kind of roughly 18-month period of his experience with this very fast-moving, very aggressive cancer. And his experience of cancer was then paralleled by my brother, Dave, who, right as my dad got sick, began this kind of deep dive into his own mental illness and depression, or his own depression and addiction. And so we lost him to suicide 6 months after we lost my dad.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry.
So these two losses on top of each other, which, you're just immersed in it for a while, for a time. And I think for me as a psychologist, well, let me say first, as a daughter and a sister, watching my family unravel and losing these people that I love and in sort of these, this way that's outside of time. So both of these illnesses, both depression and cancer, they're long, they're a slow burn. There's lots of moments of sickness and lots of this sort of slow unraveling. But then they're also punctuated by these acute moments of crisis, right? When the cancer moves to the brain and suddenly someone is unable to walk anymore, or when my brother experienced his first suicide attempt. There are these big crises in the middle of this long chronic unraveling. And so writing was, where I went as I was trying to notice what was happening to me and to these people I loved. And then over time, and it hasn't been a lot of time, but over time, then bringing in my life as a psychologist and making the connections between kind of my head and my heart, my soul and my intellectual training, my professional life. Is really what the book is doing, is sort of wrapping all those pieces together.
Was your brother's situation, was that triggered by what was going on with your dad, or just coincidentally, it just started to happen for him?
I believe it was triggered by what was going on with my dad. I mean, every time that my dad had a significant turn for the worse, my brother experienced some kind of crisis. And the kind of seeds of the unraveling were there in the sense that my brother had long struggled with alcohol abuse and had been somewhat isolated. He moved from California to live in the mountains in Montana. And so he would run a ski lift in Big Sky in the winter and be a river raft guide in Yellowstone in the summer. So he had this sort of beautiful mountain life, but he was also quite isolated. And so I think there were some things that were probably not very well within him. And then as my dad got ill, the timing of each of those turns was correlated with my brother's own deepening illness.
So, I mean, come on, this is crazy. This is so crazy. I mean, it's so tragic. How did you deal with this specifically? I mean, yes, you wrote the book, but I'm kind of, what is this book about for you, aside from, merging these two worlds together in a sense?
Well, the title comes from this sense that it is possible to be fully present to grief and pain and the trauma of this kind of loss, particularly the trauma around the loss by suicide, which I think is its own kind of loss. And also to be in this other world of joy. I'm also raising children. I'm also growing a business and a life. And so for me, some of the work has been to go back and forth to be able to navigate how to move between being present for loss and grief and also being present for joy and love. And that's taken lots of forms. One of the things that really changed in me as I entered this world, was to take very seriously my need to express not only verbally with words, but through my body. So I did a deep dive into the practice of aerial arts and have become
I saw that on your website.
Yeah.
Wow.
Which is both athletic and very emotionally expressive.
Okay. How old are your kids?
They are actually next week turning 12 and 16.
Wow.
So through the time of these losses, we're 8 and 12.
Okay.
Littler.
How successful were you at being present when this was going on? Because on our best day, right, for many of us, being present is a challenge, and in times of grief, it can be a real struggle. How did you manage that? How did you get better at that?
I think I found new ways of presence, or maybe old ways of presence, but I found myself just holding my kids a lot. I found myself saying, we're just going to watch a movie, and just cuddle up right beside me. And I felt like I couldn't give them language and assurance. I couldn't do some of the like higher cognitive pieces of parenting very well, but I could hold them. I could provide them physical presence. I could let them feel that my body was alive, that my heart was beating, and my arms were around them. So that was the kind of presence that felt successful. Being patient, being on top of things, not at all. I'm grateful to have a good parenting partner in my husband, but I have so much empathy for anyone who's trying to parent and then also go through deep emotional complexity, whether it's grief or trauma. Just the ability to like return library books and sign permission slips and remember school lunches was just beyond my capacity many days. So those are hard days. And those are things that I talk about with my children now that it's a little bit in the past. Like, hey, remember when we didn't return library books for like 3 months and the librarian at your school was like out to kill me? Like we just acknowledge the limits of what's possible in those phases of our lives.
After I asked that question and you were saying, well, I was present holding my kids, and I found myself holding my kids more, I thought to myself, that's so vital. Those simple acts. I mean, just to be able to do that, right, is so vital. Did you find yourself as someone with all this training and as a psychologist, were you feeling guilty for the way you were acting? Did you find yourself judgmental about yourself?
I think, like all people who've lost someone to suicide, I had to do the mental gymnastics around what could I have done differently? How could I have been more loving, more helpful, more supportive? I don't know that anybody gets a pass on that. The helpful thing is that I did know that I was doing it, right? I had some awareness of the game of guilt and responsibility that I was playing. And I had wonderful resources in my friends to sort of be a sounding board for that. I was grateful because of my training, I think, to have a little bit of extra grace. There were times when I had some of the symptoms that I've helped other people through for years, right? Unable to sleep, unable to think of anything else, feel like I can't breathe, nauseous, just all the physiological symptoms that we often support people through. And I could recognize that it was happening. And I didn't necessarily have wonderful solutions for it right there in the moment, right? I couldn't just like snap my fingers and heal myself, but I could just say, okay, this is what I'm holding, and I can be gentle.
Who's the book for?
I think it's for anyone who's in grief. I wrote it when the grief was very raw. So it isn't a how-to book. It isn't a wonderful solution. There's no magic answers in the book, but it tells a bunch of very small stories, some of which are about really dark moments. Some are really funny. Some are really loving. There's the full emotional range. And I want to normalize that for people,
Mhm.
for them to acknowledge that anything that they're feeling in the throes of grief has a place in the story, has a place within them.
It seems like there's so much craziness going on in the world right now that a book like this, I would find really welcome. And I think we need more and more to normalize trauma, to normalize grief. Were there things that when you were going through this that people said to you that helped you, that maybe you've, or alternatively that you found kind of annoying? Like for me, I know when people say, well, a lot of people go through this, they're resilient. I find that very annoying because it completely negates my own individual experience. But what was your experience with any of that?
Yeah. It's a really like fancy way to say you're fine.
Right.
But when inside you're like, I'm not fine. Nothing about this feels fine. Not
Right.
fine.
Right.
My favorite thing that someone said to me was my friend Jamie. And she just said, do you want to tell me a story about your brother? And I loved that so much because it gave me permission to keep him alive, to tell a live story about him, to have his name sort of spoken from my mouth. And it also was a story about him that wasn't about his death.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's what overshadows the life of somebody that you lose, is people want to, how are you doing after his death? Like, it just feels like that's the story instead of like, oh, this person that I loved that was alive. So the simple invitation, do you want to tell me a story about your brother?
I love that.
Was really lovely.
Wow.
The things that were less helpful were the prescriptive things, right? One friend said, well, you sort of knew this might happen. And she didn't mean it in an unkind way, but it felt so unkind because it felt like, oh, you saw this coming. So, well, obviously he's dead. Like it just, it took away any of the emotion from it because it made it so cognitive, right? This was predictable. Cancer is predictable. The day that my dad was diagnosed, we pretty much knew that he would die from this disease, but it doesn't eliminate any of the grief process. The knowing it's going to happen doesn't give anyone a hall pass from the pain of it.
Do you feel that people need to learn how to grieve or allow themselves to grieve, and that we don't necessarily do that, or that people think that there's a certain way to grieve, like, oh, I should be doing this or I'm not doing that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of expectation that grief happens quietly, politely, and quickly. And even the leave that people get when they are employed, maybe you get 2 days bereavement leave, maybe a week if you have a really generous employer or a really good job. When I lived in West Africa, there were this sort of process around a funeral, and a funeral was at least a week where people come from all over and everybody wears this black and red fabric. And so you communicate to everyone not in your grief party that you're in grief, but everybody in your grief party is wearing the same fabric. So you're in it together. There's this sort of identity, there's a club. And in, the Western world, grief is so isolated. You might go to a memorial service for a couple hours, but you pack up the leftovers and you go home and you do whatever you do. So there's not a lot of communalization of grief. There's certainly not a lot of cultural acceptance of emotional expression related to grief. I wrote an essay in the book about how to cry on airplanes, because I was traveling on airplanes all the time while this was happening. And I would get on the airplane and I was buckled in my seat and I was quiet and still. and there was nothing to really distract myself with. And inevitably, Guy, I would cry. I would cry on every flight. And I'm like a functional professional adult who's like sobbing by the window seat, wearing a hoodie over my head, trying to deal with all this emotion that's happening in public. And I just wish we had, an armband or some sort of signifier to the outside world that this person is in grief. So yeah, they might cry. It's okay. We laugh in public. We can cry in public. It doesn't hurt anybody.
Oh man. Wow. The book sounds amazing. And I just think the way you've been articulating this process sounds like a sob or a balm, I think, that we need during this time that we're living in. The book is called Touching Two Worlds, and it's going to be out at the end of July. Where can people get it?
It is in all the places. It's
all the places
available wherever books are sold. Okay. So Amazon, your local bookstore down the street should be there. There's an audio version of the book.
Did you do it?
I did do it. Yeah,
awesome.
I did do it. It was an interesting thing to read the book aloud in the studio, and the audio engineer on the other side was very wonderful and gentle. But there were times when I stopped in the middle and just like had to cry or had to have my own intimate experience with the stories in the book. But I think it came out really, really well.
How do you think the experience of your father and brother's passing in writing this book has influenced or impacted you as a psychologist?
I'm so much less in my head. I mean, I trained at wonderful places. I had wonderful mentors. I'm a very well-trained scientist practitioner. But I definitely operate a little bit more from my gut and from my experience than I used to. I hope that's good. It feels right. I hope it's good for my clients. But there's this sort of intuitive knowing that feels really important at this phase in my career. And I think that sharing these stories has certainly a different dimension now, because many of my clients know about this part of my life. It's public, it's sort of out there. So if you are thinking about working with me and you Google me, like if you click a few times, like you'll find this story. And so there's not the separateness of professional and client, of healer and one to be healed that I used to experience. And there are pros and cons about that shift. I don't mean to say that's the right way to be. It's just the way that I am. It's just what's happened.
Well, I would say that that's an awesome shift, I think. And it feels like a really human shift in my experience and in my perception. Yeah. And I think that's vital, especially when you're working with people who've been experiencing or have experienced trauma. Wow. All right, Sherry, what's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
Yeah, I'm touching2worlds.com is the site for the book, and there's an email link there. I'm also on Instagram and Twitter as @SherryWalling. So that's a great place to keep up with my antics.
Okay. And we'll have that linked up here at the show notes page at thetraumatherapistpodcast.com. Sherry, thank you so much for sharing your story. So poignant, and I think definitely something that people are going to need to hear and definitely read in the book. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Guy. It's been a gift to be in conversation with you.
All right. Take care.
Okay.
Thank you so much for listening and supporting this podcast. And if you'd like to join the hundreds of other therapists who are each month keeping up to date and informed and inspired about what's going on in the world of trauma, I'd love to invite you to head on over to the Trauma Therapist newsletter. That's the traumatherapistnewsletter.com.